Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to today's bonus upload. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost you a cent. Click that like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon. And folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to today's bonus, shall we? Today's first part of the upload. I've had a few experiences over the years living in Appalachia while I was a kid. I would see what I referred to as a dark, shaggy man watching us from time to time, and was always mocked as having an active imagination. As years went by working in the woods, myself and a few others saw what we at first thought was a creepy guy off in the distance, sitting on a downed tree in a ghillie suit watching us. Above his head was a post sign, aka property marker. Later on, when we were up by said downed tree, is when I realized that sitting this man's head reached that 6-foot marker, whereas I sat on the tree in the same spot. Being 6 foot, the sign was a foot above my head, and he seemed to have just disappeared. We still passed it off as a large man in a ghillie suit creepily watching us, until a few of us were partying and camping in that area a few years later, and came across loud snapping sounds in the middle of the night. It could have been from the pouring rain, but the next morning, not too far from our camp, a huge footprint, in spirit handprint, was on the hillside going up to our camp. That kind of sent the chills down my spine. A little bit considering it wasn't too far from where we were camping. I told the others about it and they laughed at me, so we decided together that the 13 of us would go hiking in the area in the middle of the night. We all got spooked by what started as a whoop, which we were thinking could have been a deer or a moose, but it quickly switched to a low guttural growl, then to a roar. Not one of us was stuck around to see what the hell it was. As we turned and started hauling ass out of there, a large tree branch went flying past us, which got us moving a lot faster. Not one of us was brave enough to go back, or think to grab a camera, or anything like that. That made me a believer, regardless of what anyone else says. In 1980, on a camping trip through the Boundary Waters, we were about 100 yards out from our new campsite when movement caught my eye. On shore, about 50 yards from our camp, something huge and hairy leapt from the beach bank into the woods. There were 10 of us, but only myself and one other guy saw it. I was only 14 years old at the time, but I knew it wasn't a bear or a moose, which we did see a few days later at a different lake. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night, or the rest of that trip. This happened just north of Cottage Grove, Oregon, on the I-5, 10 miles from the London Trackway. It was after dark on a moonless night, and this creature was fully lit from head to toe for my headlights. My first thought was, wow, that guy's arms are huge. I figured his upper arm was a foot wide. I thought it was a man until it took a step and I could see its entire bottom of its foot, toes down, knee bent at about 90%. I then knew exactly what it was. I figured it was about 7.5 to 8 feet tall as compared to the cars. It was an orangish-brown color from head to toe, except at the bottom of its feet, and what I thought was its palm. They were very light, off-white, or a light tan color. It looked like a man in a snowsuit with a hood up, as its head was very large and came to a point on the top. There was no visible neck. It was tall, shack-like figure. But as it was at the side of the road walking away from me, I didn't see its face. It was quite upright and didn't seem to be in any hurry. It had just crossed a 4-lane highway in the dark with no streetlights and no flashlight. As I am a field researcher and the encounter was very excited, but I would have liked to have seen its face. My dogs woke me up barking, and I looked out toward the field, and they were circling a big, dark blob. I'm thinking, oh, dear Lord. I started to open my window to call them back, and this thing stood up and took off toward the mountain. Stepped over a barbed wire fence. The second time, I was screaming at it in my yard at about 15 feet away, and we got a spotlight on it going up 45-degree grade on the mountain beside the house. Through the briar thicket, a goat wouldn't have been able to go through. They killed my chickens. They didn't eat them. They killed my dog, swiped all the fruit from the trees and bushes, tore the door off my breezeway, and left it in my yard. Dropped trees to the creek path, etc. Long durations of moans embedded with ooh-ee-oh sounds, rock clacking, wood knocks, etc. This was the summer of 2016. The lake dried up a bit and the water level was down about 20 feet. I was up at Ice House Reservoir in the California mountains. It was the 4th of July weekend and we wanted to go camping. My dad's been there before and he wanted to show me his spot. The weather was nice. After setting up camp, me, my sister, my 2 stepbrothers, and I decided to go for a walk. We went down to the water, and we were looking for stuff. I turned my head, and I thought I was staring at a dead redwood tree that broke off at about 9 feet. But I started noticing limbs, arms, legs. Then I saw facial features. I turned to look at my sister and stepbrothers, and their jaws were dropped. They were completely in shock. I looked back, and it started to walk away. Once we couldn't see it anymore, you can hear branches breaking and tree limbs. It sounded like a bulldozer going through there. We took off as fast as we could. My stepbrother kept falling because he had flip-flops on. He took those off and bolted on big and sharp rocks. He was so scared. My feet were all cut up when we got back to camp. He told our dad we saw Bigfoot. He told us it was a bear. By it didn't even look close to a bear. It was more human than anything. I was too in shock to speak. My sister stayed in the car for the rest of the day in shock. She didn't want to leave the safety of that car. I remember it like it was yesterday. Today's second part of the upload. This was one of those gorgeous late September days that make one glad to be alive and can be in God's creation. The sun was bright, if not overly warm. The air was so clear that every tree stood in stark relief, each an individual due to the early morning shower here in this land of many showers. Gary and I had taken advantage of the weather to play hooky, and to see if we could bag a blue grouse or 2. At least, this was the excuse we gave ourselves. Actually, we both knew we were here mainly to enjoy the day and perhaps be able to spot some elk. To this end, we found ourselves near Lake Azette on Washington's Olympic Peninsula. Gary was a forester and log buyer for a hardwood company, and he managed their tree farm near Deep Creek on the very northern tip of the peninsula. My logging company was on an enforced fire danger shutdown and had been for a few days. Dry weather and low humidity in the fall was a deadly combination in the woods. Low humidity, coupled with the unseasonably warm temperatures, made for a dangerous fire situation. In fact, virtually every major forest fire in this area had occurred in September and October, due to the described conditions. We both felt that the earlier precipitation, coupled with the higher humidity levels, would probably allow the State Department of Natural Resources to lift the fire ban, and we could return to work the next day. That made this day that much more precious. Our perambulations found us late in the morning on a small no-name tributary to South Creek, just a few miles south of Lake Ozette. We were stopped in a gravel pit there to glass the surrounding area for elk. Just to the east of this pit was a clear cut that was clearly visible to us in our elevated position, and we judged the age of the brush growing there to be about perfect to feed elk and deer. We had been at this for 20 minutes or so when we spotted a deer feeding her way along the edge of the cutting unit. I told Gary where to look to find her as I watched her going about her own business. As he was trying to locate her, he suddenly jumped. "Look to the left of that big burnt stump west of the creek," he blurted out suddenly. I switched from my 12-power binoculars to my 8-power glasses because of the much wider field they presented. They make it easier to locate something in a wide area of search. I began to systematically search of the appropriate area of clear-cut, trying to locate a large burnt stump in a sea of large burnt stumps. After a few moments of searching, I spotted what he saw. A very large bear ripping away in a rotten log there in search of some tasty grubs for his dinner. He was sleek and fat, obviously well-conditioned for his soon-to-be enforced period of sleep. It's not every year that bears hibernate here. The weather is normally just too mild to require it for the most part, and food is available to them all 12 months of the year. Some years, however, the snows hit this area hard and heavy, and they will find themselves a warm, dry spot to sleep through the worst part of winter. This fellow was obviously well equipped for just such an event. For the better part of an hour, we watched him as he contentedly ripped the log to ribbons and feasted on the hordes within. As we kept an eye on him, we continued glassing the rest of the unit, and eventually, as we knew what happened, a band of Roosevelt elk made their way into the lush feed provided by an open-aired unit. As is their wont, they didn't come far into the open, but fed mainly along the edge, taking advantage of the brush growing even back into the standing timber because of the increased light levels now available. As we watched, about 60 head were moving along slowly. There were more in the timber, and out of sight was obvious as well. There were cows and calves and occasional young bull, with no larger bulls, as we felt there should be at this time of the year. Late September is the onset of their breeding season, and the rut brings out big bulls. As we watched them, we heard a bulge sounding. It was a high, screeching squeal and grunt of a large bull announcing his presence. We didn't know then if it was the warning call of the herd master or another challenging bull. This is why we were here. The two blue grouse and the Bronco was just an excuse, but this was the reason. We studied the layout very carefully and decided upon an approach tactic. Our goal was to circle around to the far side of the herd and approach them from within the standing timber, thereby catching them between us and the open clear-cut. Our wish was to get in close enough to get some good pictures, but just seeing them close up would be fun. Our plan worked to a T. We approached the feeding herd from within the standing old growth timber until we reached a point where we were actually inside the herd. I had elk all around me. I wasn't threatening them, just walking along them slowly and talking to them with my cow call. They would look at me and mew softly or bark at their calf and return to feeding. We had not yet spotted the herd bull, but had seen several smaller bulls, last year's calves mostly, and while they were no longer nursing, they hung around with their mom. As we continued along with them, we knew there was a 90-degree angle ahead of us, and they would then have to go into the open clear cut, and we would be able to see the big bull. That was our thought and our plan. The actuality was somewhat different, however, as when they reached the corner, the bulk of the herd would not go into the open. They turned back and nearly ran us over in their escape. I saw one 5-point bull during this retreat, and I thought the whole herd had escaped back past us until I heard a noise ahead of me. There was a small hill just before me, so I hurried up the hill and found myself at a very end of the standing timber. Directly in front of me were about 30 elk in a small depression. They were bottled up there as they could only exit in one at a time, so had to wait on the one in front to leave before the next could make the short jump to get clear. I was in awe of this specter when I heard the bulls bulge again and looked up the hill to my left. There he was. He was absolutely magnificent. His antlers were very high and sported 8 points per side. When he laid his head back to bulge his anger again, his antler tips were nearly at his hips. He is, even until today, the largest Roosevelt elk I had ever seen, keeping in mind that large Rocky Mountain elk will weigh about 800 pounds live weight. This bull would have topped 1,400 pounds easily. He was absolutely massive. I watched as he continued to call his harem back together and slowly made his way out of the clear-cut and back into the adjacent timber. For several minutes after he left my sight, I could hear him bugling, and he was still calling his cows back to him. I saw over 100 elk in that herd. I don't know if he would breed them all, but I have no doubt what he could if given the chance. As the action died down, I knew that I totally lost contact with Gary and should make my way back toward the Bronco, so I chose a route and started out. I knew I was probably 2 miles from the Bronco, so decided to make a long swing through the timber, keeping to higher ground to avoid the chance of getting into one of the myriad swamps and that plagued this area. Although I knew it added a distance to my trek, if it kept me out of the low stuff, I'd be happy. As I moved down off the ridge I was walking, I spotted a break in the trees ahead of me and below. This happens fairly often in this area, and it generally indicates an area too boggy to grow even cedar trees. Since this was on my route, I decided to get a bit closer to see what I was dealing with. As I neared the opening, I realized it was not a bog or a swamp, but an area of blown down trees. It was covered about 4 acres, perhaps a bit more, and the blown down was pretty neatly arranged, looking for all the world like it had been felled and bucketed. The trees lie side by side, only the upturned root wads on some of them showing that this was not the result of a logger run amok. Many of them were broken off from 8 to 30 feet off the ground. The result was an open area in the midst of a pure stand of timber. This type of opening is normally caused by lightning striking one, usually the largest tree in the vicinity, and breaking it off. In an old growth stand, this creates a large opening, and a heavy wind can cause the neighbor tree to be blown down in the area. This action continues until this area, as much as 10 acres, is created. In particular heavy storms, entire regions can be blown flat. In 1921, such a storm devastated the Pacific slope of the Olympic Peninsula, and there are vast stretches of timber that started growing after this storm. It flattened an area of 15 miles wide and 100 miles long. As I moved closer to the edge of this curious anomaly, I noticed 2 figures about 50 yards from the timber's edge. They appeared to be feeding, and the memory of that big bear we had watched earlier leapt to my mind. I quickly found myself a spot where the wind was directly from them to me, and I could sit quietly and observe them for a while. As I raised my 8-power binoculars, my 12-power glasses have been left back at the truck for a closer look. The first thing that struck me was these were definitely not bears. They were bipedal, and they were bent over picking something off a downed log in front of them. I looked around me and noticed oyster mushrooms growing on the downed trees. It was obvious that this was what they were feeding on. Oyster mushrooms are very tasty, eaten right off the log, and I've had them their feast. For several minutes I watched them feed from my hidden spot at the edge of the timber. I had perfect view of these great creatures as they diligently fed. Every minute or so, first one, then the other would rise up to its full height and survey the area around them. One, while standing, was over a foot taller than the other. I was quite sure the larger was a male and the smaller was a female, until she turned toward me and I could see fully frontal. That removed all doubt. She had very ample breasts, thus there was no further question as to what I was witnessing. With great interest I listened to their communication and marveled at what I was seeing. The male was especially magnificent. As I watched, he would examine everything in a 360-degree circle. When he saw something unusual, he would stop and make an utterance to the female, and she would hunker down low until she was almost indistinguishable from the logs. I wondered at this behavior until once, as she rose, I could see she had a young one with her. It was definitely quite small in comparison, not even large enough to be seen above the downed logs until she lifted it. I immediately went back to my glasses and watched this strange family as they fed on these pure white oyster mushrooms. I was totally enthralled with what I was seeing here and left no compulsion to leave any time soon. Quietly the family fed toward me until at last they were no more than 20 yards distant. Their conversation was remarkably clear at their closest point, and I was in a kind of heaven as I watched this family, and was hoping it would last just a bit longer. I knew that by this time Gary would be back at the Bronco, but he would not be worried about my tardiness, as we had done this often, and every time one of us had gotten distracted and we were returning late. The standard procedure in this case was to break out the Coleman stove we always carried and put on a pot of coffee, heat up a can or two of whatever we had at hand. As I watched quietly, wishing there were a way I could talk with my guests, I suddenly felt a breath of air on the back of my neck. Heretofore the breeze had been in my face. Instantly, both heads snapped directly toward me. I knew they had made me. My idle was over, so with both the male and female trying to locate my hidden spot, I merely stood up and moved to where they could see me easily. I didn't want to frighten them, and felt that if they knew what was there, they might not be so frightened. That they would now be leaving, I knew of certainty. But they didn't have to be scared off. I spoke to them as they turned to leave. "Thank you for allowing me to see you," I said quietly. "Please be of good health with your family." For a moment the pair stopped and both looked back at me, as if they didn't know exactly what to make of me. Slowly they turned back in the way they were going to depart the area. When they reached the edge of the standing timber, the female moved into the darker timber with the youngster, while the male stopped and turned slowly back toward me. He made no sound, nor did he gesture, but for a long moment he paused and looked directly at me, holding his gaze for just a bit before he nodded his head at me and turned and stepped into the timber, following his mate and child. I waited a bit longer in case he may return, although I knew he wouldn't. It took a few moments to gather some of the delicious mushrooms and resume my trek out of the woods. As I had expected, when I broke out of the timber and walked the last few yards to the Bronco, there was Gary with a hot cup of coffee and a lunch prepared of Chef Boyardee ravioli and potato salad. To this I added a nice batch of translucent white oyster mushrooms, and we enjoyed a pleasant repast there beside a tiny logging road in the middle of nowhere. Each lost in our own thoughts. Gary tried a couple of times to get a conversation underway, but about the elk we had seen. I acknowledged that subject and even participated in a manner, but truth be told, my mind was not on elk at that moment. I wanted to share what I had seen, but I knew Gary would not understand. He had no experiences with these beings, and he was clearly not going to believe my experiences of spending time with the family. I kept my console to myself about the family, but I knew I had been the recipient of something very special. I knew these beings lived as we live, in a family group. They are devoted parents and care for their young as we care for our own. Thank you, dear family, for allowing me this privilege. All right, folks, there you have it. Today's bonus upload. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you, honestly, all for supporting the channel. It is your support that keeps this channel growing and going, and what gives people a place to share their experiences and theories judgment-free. Thank you. Stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real, they are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for answers, and God bless.